When the world grows loud, the mind forgets its own voice. It becomes like a river disturbed by wind, no longer reflecting the sky, only carrying ripples of confusion. In such moments, a new self does not need to be created. It only needs to be uncovered. For beneath all noise, there is already a still presence waiting to be known. There are times when life speaks in many directions at once. Opinions press upon the mind, desires pull it forward, fears push it backward. In this constant movement, a person begins to believe that clarity must be found outside, through more knowledge, more possessions, more validation. Yet the more one gathers from the outside, the more scattered the inner world becomes. It is like trying to calm a storm by collecting more clouds. True clarity does not arrive through accumulation, it arrives through silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of awareness, where thoughts are seen without being followed, where emotions arise without being commanded, where the self is no longer a prisoner of reaction. In that space, something subtle begins to change. The noise does not disappear, but it loses authority. To find the echoes of a new self is not to become someone else. It is to recognize what was never truly lost. Beneath habits, beneath roles, beneath the stories repeated by memory, there exists a simple awareness that observes everything but is attached to nothing. This awareness is not shaped by praise or insult, success or failure. It remains steady like the mountain, even when clouds pass over it. A person seeking clarity often tries to fix the world first, yet the deeper path begins inward. When attention is turned back toward the source of thought, the chain of confusion begins to weaken. One sees that most suffering is not created by life itself, but by resistance to life as it is. In this seeing, the burden slowly loosens. The new self that emerges is not loud. It does not announce itself. It does not demand recognition. It moves with simplicity. It speaks less, but understands more. It reacts less, but perceives more deeply. It is not driven by the need to become, because it has understood the value of simply being. Clamor belongs to the surface of existence. It is the sound of unfinished understanding. But beneath that surface lies a deeper current, quiet, patient, unbroken. When one learns to rest attention in that current, life begins to reveal a different rhythm. Decisions become clearer, not because more effort is applied, but because confusion has reduced. Even in the middle of noise, clarity can be untouched. Just as the depths of the ocean remain still while waves disturb the surface, so too can the inner awareness remain undisturbed while life continues its movement. The practice is not to fight the waves, but to recognize the depth. As this recognition grows, the idea of a separate, struggling self begins to fade. What remains is a more natural way of living, responsive, awake, and unburdened by unnecessary struggle. One begins to act not from compulsion, but from understanding, not from fear, but from clarity. In this state, even ordinary moments carry meaning. A breath becomes a reminder of presence, a pause becomes a doorway to insight, silence becomes not an absence but a fullness that does not need to speak to be known. The echoes of a new self are not distant. They are already present in every moment where attention returns home from distraction. Each time the mind stops chasing and simply observes, a fragment of clarity is revealed, and over time, these fragments form a continuous light. There is no need to rush toward transformation. The unfolding happens naturally when noise is no longer mistaken for truth, when outer clamor is seen as passing weather, and inner awareness is recognized as the sky that never changes. Life begins to settle into its own wisdom. In that settling, one understands without effort. Clarity was never absent. It was only overlooked. Clarity is found in inner silence, not external noise. True understanding arises when the mind steps back from distractions and rests in awareness beyond thoughts and emotions. Clarity is not something that arrives from outside like a gift carried by circumstances. It is something that becomes visible when the constant noise of the mind is no longer given full control. In ordinary living, attention is pulled in many directions at once. Thoughts speak over thoughts, memories compete with expectations, and emotions rise without being fully understood. In such a condition, clarity feels distant, as if it belongs to another time or another person. Yet it is not absent, it is simply covered. When the mind is filled with continuous activity, it becomes difficult to distinguish what is true from what is merely repeated. Much of what a person believes is shaped by reaction rather than awareness. A comment from someone else, a small failure, a sudden fear, or even a desire can create waves that distort perception. In these moments, decisions are made quickly but not deeply. Action happens but without inner alignment. This is how confusion slowly becomes a habit. Inner silence is not the absence of thought, but the absence of unnecessary involvement with thought. Thoughts may still appear, just as clouds appear in the sky, but they no longer define the entire space of awareness. When attention is not constantly attached to each passing idea, a natural stillness begins to emerge. In that stillness, things start to be seen more clearly, not because reality has changed, but because perception has become less distorted. Clarity grows in this quiet space, like light appearing in a room when the curtains are gently opened. There is no force involved. Nothing needs to be pushed away violently. Instead, there is a soft recognition that not every thought requires response, not every emotion demands action, and not every moment needs interpretation. In this recognition, the mind begins to relax its constant effort to control everything. As this relaxation deepens, awareness becomes more stable. A person begins to notice the space between thoughts, the pause between reactions, and the subtle background presence that observes everything without judgment. This presence does not rush, it does not argue, it simply sees. And in this seeing, confusion begins to lose its intensity. Eventually, life is experienced differently. The same world remains, but the inner relationship to it changes. Challenges still arise, but they are no longer magnified by unnecessary mental noise. Choices still need to be made, but they come from a quieter and more balanced place. This is how clarity reveals itself, not as something added, but as something uncovered when silence is allowed to speak more loudly than thought. Does not create inner peace. More opinions, desires, and information often increase confusion rather than solve it. Clarity comes from letting go, not collecting more. Accumulation is often mistaken for understanding. A person gathers more ideas, more opinions, more experiences, believing that each addition will bring them closer to clarity. Yet the mind does not become clearer simply by becoming fuller. Instead, it begins to resemble a crowded room where every voice speaks at once and none is truly heard. In such a condition, confusion is not an accident, it is the natural result of excess mental holding. When external input becomes constant, inner perception loses its sharpness. The mind starts reacting faster than it observes. It forms conclusions before it has truly understood. In this rush, life is interpreted through fragments rather than wholeness. What is seen is immediately labeled, and what is labeled is rarely questioned. Over time, this creates a layer of mental noise that feels normal but quietly distorts clarity. True understanding does not depend on how much one carries in the mind. It depends on how lightly one holds it. When attention is not tightly bound to every passing thought, there is room for deeper insight to appear. This does not require rejecting life or withdrawing from experience. It simply requires a different relationship with experience, one where observation is more important than reaction and awareness is more important than conclusion. As mental activity slows, something subtle begins to emerge. Thoughts still arise, but they lose their urgency. Emotions still appear, but they no longer dominate perception. In this space, awareness becomes more reflective, like still water that can finally show an undistorted image of what stands before it. The mind, once crowded, begins to open. This openness is not emptiness in a negative sense. It is a kind of spaciousness where understanding can grow naturally without constant interference. Perception becomes more precise. Small details are noticed without distortion. Larger patterns are seen without confusion. Life is no longer filtered through layers of assumption, but experienced more directly. In this state, decisions become simpler. There is less internal debate because there is less internal noise. Action arises not from pressure, but from clarity of seeing. What needs to be done becomes evident without forceful thinking. What does not need attention naturally fades into the background. Gradually, the mind learns that it does not need to grasp everything to understand anything. In fact, the more it loosens its grip, the more clearly it perceives. This realization transforms the inner world. Instead of constantly adding, one begins to understand the value of allowing space. And in that space, clarity is no longer searched for. It is recognized as something that was never truly lost, only hidden beneath unnecessary accumulation. The new self is not created but uncovered beneath habits, roles, and conditioning. There is a steady awareness that is already present and does not need to be built. Suffering is often understood as something that happens to a person, as if it arrives from the outside like weather that cannot be controlled. Yet when observed closely, much of what is called suffering is shaped within the mind itself. It is not only the event that creates pain, but the resistance, interpretation, and repetition that follow it. Life brings movement, some pleasant, some difficult, but the mind adds layers that can intensify or prolong the experience far beyond the moment itself. When reality is met with resistance, a silent conflict begins. What is happening is not allowed to simply be what it is. Instead, it is compared with what was expected, what was desired, or what was feared. In that comparison, tension arises. The mind begins to argue with the present moment, as if disagreement could alter what already exists. This internal struggle creates a second layer of experience, and it is often this layer that becomes the true burden. If attention is carefully observed, it becomes clear that suffering is rarely a single event. It is a sequence. First comes sensation, then thought, then reaction, then repetition. A small discomfort can grow into a heavy emotional state simply through continuous mental engagement. The mind replays, reinterprets, and reinforces the experience until it feels larger than it originally was. In this way, what begins as a moment becomes a story, and the story becomes identity. Yet when resistance is not immediately added, something different is seen. In that interpretation is often more manageable than expected. Pain may still exist, but the additional weight created by mental struggle begins to lessen. In this space of non-resistance, awareness becomes more direct. There is no need to approve or disapprove of what is happening. It is simply witnessed as it unfolds. This witnessing does not mean indifference. It means clarity without interference. Just as a mirror reflects both pleasant and unpleasant images without choosing between them, awareness can hold experience without distortion. When this quality is present, the intensity of suffering often decreases, not because circumstances have changed, but because perception has become less entangled. Over time, a deeper understanding emerges. Much of what disturbs the mind is sustained by the habit of resistance. When this habit is seen clearly, it begins to lose its automatic power. The mind learns that acceptance does not mean approval, and observation does not mean weakness. Instead, they reveal a space where experience can pass without becoming a fixed burden. In this way, suffering is no longer seen as an unavoidable weight placed upon life, but as a process that can be understood, softened, and gradually dissolved through awareness that does not fight what is already here. Suffering comes more from resistance than from life itself. Much of mental struggle arises when we resist reality instead of observing it as it is, which keeps the mind disturbed. Stillness is often misunderstood as inactivity, as if it means withdrawal from life or absence of engagement. Yet true stillness is not the absence of movement in the outer world, it is the absence of disturbance within awareness. Life may continue with its constant flow of events, responsibilities, and interactions, but within that flow there can exist a space that is not shaken by it. In that space, a different kind of understanding begins to emerge, one that does not rely on analysis alone, but on direct seeing. When the mind is constantly occupied, it becomes reactive. It responds quickly, but not always wisely. It follows patterns formed by habit, memory, and assumption. In such a state, decisions are often shaped by urgency rather than clarity. Even intelligence, when entangled in noise, loses its depth and becomes fragmented. Thoughts multiply, but insight becomes rare. Stillness interrupts this pattern not by force, but by quieting the need to immediately respond to every stimulus. Different quality. It is more stable, more sensitive, and more capable of perceiving subtle truths that are usually overlooked. In this inner quiet, something remarkable happens. Life begins to reveal patterns that were always present but not previously noticed. Situations that once seemed confusing begin to show structure. Emotional reactions that once felt overwhelming begin to appear as passing movements rather than fixed realities. Even complex problems are seen with a simplicity that was hidden beneath mental noise. This deeper intelligence does not belong to thought alone. It arises when thought is no longer the only instrument of perception. It is as if awareness itself begins to understand, without needing to translate everything into language or analysis. There is recognition without effort, clarity without struggle, knowing without accumulation. In this state, action becomes more precise. Not because one is trying harder, but because there is less internal interference. Decisions arise naturally from the situation itself rather than from fear or desire. There is responsiveness without agitation, movement without confusion. Stillness also brings a subtle sense of freedom. The mind is no longer compelled to chase every thought or resolve every mental tension immediately. It learns that not everything requires immediate conclusion. Some things can simply be observed until their meaning becomes clear on their own. Over time, this quality of stillness becomes more familiar. It is not something forced, but something remembered. And as it deepens, life is experienced with greater balance. The outer world continues with its complexity, but the inner world no longer mirrors that chaos. Instead, it reflects something steadier, more open, and more intelligent than reactive thought alone can offer. Stillness reveals a deeper intelligence within life. When attention settles into quiet awareness, decisions become clearer, reactions soften, and life is understood with greater simplicity and depth. What is often called a new self is not a construction of identity, nor a refined version of the old personality. It is not achieved through effort, nor shaped by ambition. Rather, it is a quiet unfolding that happens when the constant need to become something else begins to soften. In that softening, what remains is not a created self, but a more direct experience of being. Most of the time, Identity is built through accumulation. A person gathers labels, roles, memories, and expectations, and gradually begins to believe that this collection is who they are. Yet these elements are constantly changing. Roles shift, emotions fluctuate, and circumstances evolve. When identity is tied too tightly to these changing conditions, instability naturally follows. The mind then tries to maintain control, strengthening the very tension it seeks to avoid. A deeper stability emerges when awareness is no longer fully identified with these shifting forms. Instead of being absorbed by every thought or emotion, there is a quiet recognition of them. Thoughts arise, emotions move, experiences pass, yet something within remains steady and unaffected. This steadiness is not distant or detached, it is intimate, present, and always available, though often overlooked. In this recognition, the idea of a separate, struggling self begins to lose its weight. What once felt like a fixed identity is now seen as a flow of changing experiences within a larger field of awareness. This shift does not erase individuality. It places it in a broader context, where it no longer carries the burden of absolute definition. As this understanding deepens, life begins to feel less like a constant effort to maintain something and more like a process of responding to what is actually present. Actions become less driven by insecurity and more aligned with clarity. There is less need to prove, defend, or justify because the foundation of identity is no longer as rigid. In this space, simplicity becomes natural. There is less internal conflict because there is less clinging to fixed images of who one should be. Instead, there is openness to what is unfolding moment by moment. This openness allows for genuine adaptability where responses arise appropriately rather than habitually. The so-called new self is therefore not new in the sense of being created. It is new only in the sense of being seen clearly for the first time without distortion. It is the same presence that was always there, now no longer hidden beneath layers of mental noise and identification. In this clarity, life is experienced more directly, without unnecessary struggle between who one is and who one thinks one should become.